Returning then again tonight to the 1689 Confession. We spent a week, you remember, last week looking at the doctrine of man as it's seen in the Grace Fellowship Confession. And so tonight we return back to the 1689, picking up where we left off now in chapter 6. Chapters 1 through 5 give to us, as I've said a couple times now, sort of the theoretical realities of God's creation and decree and providence and so forth. Not that they're impractical, they certainly are very practical. These things all work themselves out, of course, in time and space. So I'm not suggesting that things are not real to us. But when we talk about the divine decree, that's something in the character of God. We don't have access to it. We see it by peripheral vision. Same is true of his providence. We see it by peripheral vision. Creation, we were not there. We see it by peripheral vision. But now as we come into chapter 6, we come to a much more concrete reality that involves us. And while we can't say that we were there, we could say that, yeah, in a way we were. And that's what the confession will argue here in chapter 6, which is entitled, Of the Fall of Man, of Sin, and of the Punishment Thereof. Because they couldn't find a longer title for the chapter, so they decided to add all of that. But you'll notice it has three primary parts just by virtue of the title. The fall of man, of sin, meaning of the nature of sin, which is a result of it, and then of the punishment thereof, or the results that come as a result of the fall. So that's what we're going to look at in these 5 paragraphs tonight. So we begin with the first, which reads as follows. Although God created man upright and perfect, and gave him a righteous law, which had been unto life had he kept it, and threatened death upon the breach thereof, yet he, that is man, did not long abide in this honor. Okay, so there's a summary of the reality of the creation of man prior to the fall. God created man upright and perfect, which we saw in our discussion of man from the Grace Fellowship Confession last week. So we were created upright, morally upright, or man, I should say, was created morally upright. Adam was created with a morally neutral nature, that he was allowed the freedom to act morally. He had such a freedom, and he had such an ability to act according to his choices, and he was made upright and perfect. God looked at man and saw him to be very good, not just good, but very good, because man was the pinnacle of God's intention and creation in the world. Okay, so God created man in this state and gave him a righteous law. Now, there's 2 ways to interpret that. The most intrinsic sense of that is that God gave to Adam a specific prohibition, a specific law. Okay, you may eat of any tree of the garden except this one. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. On the day you eat from it, you shall surely die. Okay, so there's a law in the sense that God gave to Adam a specific moral command in that. And we have a tendency to sort of go there automatically when we see this. God gave him a righteous law. But I would suggest that the reason they don't specifically say that in the confession is because they actually have a broader understanding of what this righteous law looks like. It's more than just a specific prohibition to the tree. It involves the entire nature of the man in terms of his relationship with the creation and, more importantly, his relationship with God. Adam was given a responsibility to be the man that God made him to be, not just to avoid the tree, but to fulfill the creation mandate we see in Genesis 1. Take dominion over all things, be fruitful and multiply. Those are just as much a command as don't eat from the tree is. The don't eat from the tree is a negative command. To take dominion is a positive command. So this righteous law that's being referred to here is the totality of the nature of man's responsibility as God gave it to him. God gave to Adam a responsibility. You are to be all that I've created you to be. Okay? And that involves the entirety of creation, with a specific prohibition against the tree. But nonetheless, that's a part of a larger reality. Okay, so God had given to Adam a righteous law, and this law which had been unto life had he kept it, meaning that if Adam keeps this law that's inherent within him, that's given to him by God, including the specific prohibition of the tree, he would have lived on forever. All right, this is, by the way, one of the ways the confession points out that the idea of death did not yet exist in creation. Okay, so theistic evolution is done away with by this statement from the confessor's point of view. There can be no death prior to Adam because Adam is the one who brings death into the world, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so Adam would have been continually living an immortal existence in a mortal body to the end of time and beyond if he would have obeyed it, and all of his progeny with him. Okay? But not only is it true that he would have lived forever had he kept this law, and God also threatened death upon the breach thereof. Okay, so the opposite is also true. One side of the coin is you will live forever if you do these things. The other side of the coin is you will die if you don't. Okay, so there's both sides of that equation. I would argue, and I think most solid Reformed theologians would argue, that Adam's failure to keep the prohibition of the tree was fatal, true, but his failure to keep the creation mandate would also be fatal. Because I've argued many times, have I not, that the reason why that the primary sin even of Adam was his failure to protect his wife from the serpent and to keep the serpent away from his wife, and so his failure to do that becomes unto death itself as well. So the command is not specifically just don't eat from the tree. I know we have a tendency to think that way as we look at the Genesis 2 and 3 accounts. We assume that, well, eating from the tree is what killed him. I'm going to make the argument that he failed on the entire sense of the righteous law that was established over him. And God had threatened him with death if he breached it. But we learn he did not long abide in this honor. Okay? Simply put, the man that was created sinned. He broke the command. He did not long remain. Now again, notice that the confession writers don't tell us how long it was or how long they believe it was between the time that Adam was formed from the dust of the ground and the time he ate from the tree. It doesn't say. We don't know. And the biblical account doesn't tell us. The days of the creation account end at the beginning of chapter 2. So we don't know how long this was. But nonetheless, it did not last too long for this imperfection came along. Next line. Satan, using the subtlety of the serpent to seduce Eve, then, by her seducing Adam, who without any compulsion did willfully transgress the law of their creation and the command given unto them in eating the forbidden fruit, which God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, having purposed to order it to his own glory. All right. A number of years back, I preached a sermon. I was charged with the important task of preaching a sermon called The Subtlety of Satan. And I preached this sermon because I pointed out in the sermon, my primary point in the sermon was to point out that Satan was subtle. The word subtle means that he hides his true intentions. He comes with a sense in which you do not see immediately what his intentions are. That's subtlety. It's a word that's used in the King James Version in Genesis 3:1 to describe the serpent, more subtle than all the other creatures. He was more cunning. He was more unexpected, if you will, for lack of a word. So he was subtle, and Satan used the subtlety of the serpent to seduce Eve. The discussion that the serpent, i.e. Satan through the serpent, had with Eve seduced her into eating from the tree. The word seduce means, of course, to draw away to, in some sense, or to draw one to yourself. He drew her away. The seduction of Eve was to turn her attention away from the command that God had given and the goodness thereof to herself and her personal desires. The very first sin, in essence, was for Eve to become self-centered. And that's the subtlety of Satan. He seduced her to bring her mind away from the goodness of God in this righteous law that had been given to her, which her husband had clearly told her about, to see the reality of the immortality and the perfections and all that God had given to them, and to be swayed to something else, which he subtly intended to make more enticing to her than that. He tells some half-truths and some flat-out lies in the midst of the process in order to convince her to eat from the tree, because his intention was to destroy the creature he could never be. He could never be the man or the woman who had the special love of God upon them, who had been given such a relationship with God, and he intended to destroy her, and he did so by seducing her to look away from God to herself. And so he used the subtlety to seduce Eve, who then, by seducing Adam, didn't take much apparently, here, try this. Okay? Which tells us a lot about Adam, doesn't it? It tells me a great deal about Adam. It tells me this man's failure was compounded failure upon failure, because he didn't even resist his wife giving him the fruit. And according to the biblical text, he's actually there, right? So he's observing, in a sense, of what's going on, but he fails all around. So his seduction is a lot easier than hers, apparently. So then who, without any compulsion, did willfully transgress the law of their creation? They chose to do so. They willingly ate from the tree. They knew it was wrong, and they ate from the tree nonetheless. And they transgressed the command given unto them in eating the forbidden fruit. This, however, was pleasing to God. Now, let's be careful with that word. Okay, pleasing. It doesn't necessarily mean that God was pleased in the sense that he was happy that it happened. But God was pleased in the sense that he had purposed for this to come about. That's what that last sentence is, or that last section is saying. Which God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, having purposed to order it to his own glory. God purposed the fruit of the tree to be eaten, for Eve to be seduced by the serpent, so that the fall would come. Okay? So the point of this first paragraph is being made in that last phrase. The fall of Adam and his wife and the subsequent fall of the human race did not occur as a surprise to God. It was purposed by God. The age-old question of why is there evil in the world, otherwise known as a theodicy, if God is good and he knows that men will suffer, why does he allow good men, righteous men, to suffer? Okay, that's the theodicy question. Okay, the theodicy question has an answer. It has an answer. Now, for most men, it's not a satisfactory answer, but it is an answer. And the answer is because God has purposed it for his glory. That God has purposed for there to be suffering and there to be evil and there to be sin in the world because he has purposed it to his decree. Within his decree, God has purposed that there will be sin. Now, you understand that that is a uniquely Reformed perspective. Okay? What I just said is a uniquely Reformed perspective. Because a synergist has to admit that because he frames human destiny in terms of human choice, that sin must be only on the basis of human choice and cannot be purposed by God. Thus, the theodicy question always arises amongst the synergists, because the natural inclination of the man who says, I've been acting well, I've been doing good, I've been righteous, why does God make me suffer? Again, notice the framing of the question. Why does God make me suffer if I'm doing well? Has no answer in a synergistic worldview, because it is based on the fundamental reality that, well, you know what? Your choice, your consequence, too bad. Que sera, sera, as Doris Day would say, right? And so the Reformed are able to actually give an answer to the question. And the answer is because God has purposed it. Why does evil befall us? Because God has purposed it. It is for his glory. It is his intention for Adam to fall into sin. Now, that should just be automatic. And you know why it ought to be automatic? Because we're told in Scripture that the Christ had been foreordained to come before the foundation of the world, and that there were names written in the Lamb's Book of Life before the foundation of the world. Neither of those things would be necessary before the foundation of the world if sin had not come into the world. In other words, if we start with the presupposition that God has a purpose and that he has decreed all that comes to pass, and that those things even have an eternal reality to them, meaning before the foundation of the world, then the entrance of sin into the world is not a surprise. It's a part of the plan. And part of the plan is even the suffering that goes with it. It's a part of the plan. Right? So the confession writers are making it clear that they believe that the entry of sin into the world was ordained by God according to his purposes, and God purposed it for his own glory. Hard for you and I to grasp the reality of that, but it's really not that difficult of an equation, because God has purposed it to accomplish something, and what he accomplishes brings glory to him. All right? Any questions there? Again, if somebody comes and says to you, I don't understand this whole idea of suffering and evil in the world. Why? And your answer should be, because God has purposed it for his glory. And you need to stop asking that question and start asking the deeper one. And the deeper question is, what is the purpose of all things in God? And it's not for your happiness and contentment. Now, paragraph 2. Our first parents, by this sin, and you'll notice the confession writers believe we're all descended from a set of parents, by this sin fell from their original righteousness and communion with God. They lost the original righteousness that they produced, and they lost the communion with God. The evidence is obvious. As soon as they sinned, what did they do? Hid themselves. The very first thing they did was hid themselves. They went and found a bush, and they grabbed some fig leaves and they started sewing them together in order to cover themselves. They were hiding themselves. By the way, the clothing that you wear is the result of human beings' broken relationship with God. We hide ourselves because even our own bodies now reflect the guilt and sin and shame that we possess. And even the people, we're all adults here, right? Even the people who are the most lewd in terms of their physical nature instinctively cover themselves. Have you noticed that? Why? Because there's an inherent shame. In the physical body, the first thing God formed from the dust of the ground. It's the first thing impacted by this sin. So Adam and Eve find themselves having lost their righteousness, having lost their communion with God. And the other evidence, by the way, not only were they hiding themselves, but they lost their communion with God when God banished them from the garden. Get out. No longer will you have access to the tree of life. I will set my angel here to prevent you from getting to the tree of life. Death is now your reality. I think that was a mercy, by the way. You know why? Because none of us want to live in this decayed body forever. Can you imagine? I mean, there does come a point where it's like, yeah, I'd really rather die than live in this anymore, right? But imagine if you couldn't die and you just continue to decay. It's a mercy. And our first parents fell by this sin, and get this, and we in them. Okay, I have just batted down the hatches of about 95% of Baptist life here. Okay? Because I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The vast majority of Baptist churches no longer teach or preach original sin. They no longer teach the doctrine of original sin. What was ironical to me when I was growing up in the as a Catholic, the doctrine of original sin is prominent in Catholic circles. Baptism is designed to remove it. And so we talk a lot about original sin in Catholic circles. When I became a believer, a true follower of Christ, and then went to a Baptist church, everybody stopped talking about it. And I thought that was odd. I couldn't explain why for a very long time. And then suddenly I realized, wait a minute, the reason why is because this doctrine has disappeared from too much of Baptist life. What the point the writers are making is this: when Adam fell, we fell with him. When he sinned, we sinned with him. When he became guilty, we became guilty with him. Oh, wait a minute now, preacher. Now, wait a minute. I can't be held accountable for what somebody else did. That's not right. That's not the American way. Which, by the way, answers the question of why it disappeared from Baptist churches. You see, I just gave you the answer. Because in American thinking, we're only responsible for what we do. We're not responsible for what somebody else does. I can't go to jail for what you did. But that's not how the Bible thinks. And that's not how ancient Hebrews thought either. I mean, if you want to, God himself puts it right there in the Decalogue when he says that he will visit the sins of the fathers on the third and fourth generations of those who do evil. It's going to get passed down from generation to generation. Ancient Hebrews understood this story. I could be guilty for what my dad and my grandparents did. And by the way, there is some reality of that, right? There's some reality of that we know to be true, right? There are certain traits that we possess that pass down from parent to child to grandchild. And I don't just mean looks. I mean certain behaviors, right? Right? So we died with Adam, and we were therefore now born into this world under what we call original sin, which has two components: original pollution and original guilt. Two elements of original sin are original pollution and original guilt. The original pollution side of it is we're corrupted. Every aspect of ourself is polluted. Every aspect of the human person, the imago Dei in us, has been polluted by sin. And the other side is we're guilty of Adam's sin. We have been imputed with the guilt of Adam, whereby death came upon all. Paul makes that the key argument in Romans 5. The key argument in Romans 5 is, listen, through one man came death, and all died. Why do seemingly innocent people die? Babies in vitro that have never committed a sin, yet mothers have they lose babies in the womb. Why? Doesn't make any sense. If they're innocent, why would they die? Paul's argument is death is the evidence of this reality in us. The human race dies. All human beings face death because we are inherently guilty. We have been imputed with the guilt of Adam when we're born into this world. Again, everybody in America hates that when I say that. But it's a fact. That's what the confession writers are arguing. We died with Adam. We will die because we're him. We belong to him. We're his progeny. All becoming dead in sin. Now, notice that's a different way of saying something, because it's not just saying that we all die, it's saying we all become dead in sin, which again, the synergist doesn't accept. But here it is. We not only become creatures who have a destiny of death because we sin, but we become spiritually incapable of doing anything to reverse that reality. You can't change it. You can't avert your death. You can't change your guilt. You are spiritually dead. Now, we have really tried, haven't we? For a long time. We've developed every imaginable religious system under the sun and every imaginable spiritual whatever you want to call it, under the sun. You can read the book of Judges and you got people worshiping all kinds of pagan gods. What are they doing? Attempting to resolve this fundamental reality in the human race. But the writers of this confession make it clear that you cannot change that reality. And no amount of sacrifice brought to a pagan god or even the living God will change that state. You're born with it. You could say it's in your DNA if you want to say it that way. It's in us. There's no way around it. We are spiritually dead. We cannot do anything pleasing to God that he would see us as acceptable to him. That's what Paul means when in Ephesians 2:1. But you were dead. And not only dead in sin, but wholly defiled in all the faculties and parts of soul and body. That's the original pollution part. Everything about us no longer works according to what was established in the Imago Dei that God called very good in Adam. It just doesn't work anymore. We don't think straight. We don't articulate well. We age and our bodies fall back to the dust of the ground, and we can't stop it. We can try to prevent it, but we can't stop it. We know it's true. We can't accomplish anything spiritually in such a way that God looks at us and goes, hey, that's great. We can do none of that. Original sin is the reality that when Adam sinned, his original sin became our guilt and pollution. Now again, as I said last week, unless you understand that at the core of your Christian theology, you can't understand the gospel. You can't understand the gospel if you don't start there. If you don't start with we're all guilty, dead sinners, corrupted in every imaginable way by sin, you won't get the gospel right. You just won't. Which is why we have to have this as chapter 6 before we can go further in our discussion of Christian theology. Paragraph 3. They being the root, they meaning Adam and Eve, they being the root, and by God's appointment, okay, meaning God purposed it for them, they being the root and by God's appointment, standing in the room and stead of all mankind, the guilt of the sin was imputed and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity descending from them by ordinary generation. Or what I just said. Every single human being inherited from their parents by natural generation the guilt and pollution of Adam's sin. It just passed down from generation to generation to generation. And God purposed it. God appointed for Adam and Eve to stand in this position. Now, this is what we call the federal headship of Adam. In that, when God gave the commands that he did to Adam, he intended for Adam to be the one to keep them. And as Adam went, so the race would go. So if Adam was obedient and kept the law that God had placed upon him into perpetuity, then humanity would have continued along in immortality and grace and perfection. But if Adam were to sin, then that would be passed down from him by generation. Okay? So God appointed Adam to be the federal head of a race. It was up to him to decide for good or evil on behalf of every human being that would follow him. It was up to him. Now, before you all decide to throw a lynching party in heaven for Adam, because some of you might want to do that, hey, it's your fault! We must remember what the earlier paragraph said, which is God purposed for this. So if you really want to blame someone, you can't really blame Adam. You have to blame God's decree that it purposed for it to come to pass. The good news is that I don't think any of us are going to stand before God and go, why did you allow this to happen? Because all of us are going to stand before God and go, this was your purpose and plan for your glory. He was our head. We understand what he did. Okay, we understand that he did that. He brought suffering in the world, but you know what? None of that matters because you were being glorified through it all. That's the focus, which is, by the way, the other answer to the theodicy question. It's not just that suffering is a part of God's purpose, but it's for God's glory. So it's hard for us to think like that, but that's how we're to think. Adam was a man set aside to a specific purpose. His specific purpose was to be the federal head of a race, and as he would sin, so would go his descendants. Being now conceived in sin. Not even born in sin. Okay, let's get that straight. Conceived in sin, right? From the very moment of conception, we are guilty. Where am I here? Instead of him, guilty, it was imputed in corrupt nature. Be now conceived in sin. Okay, I lost my place. And by nature, children of wrath. Okay, so now the whole human race comes under the wrath of God. The whole human race is now in obstinate rebellion against God by virtue of their position in Adam. So their positional reality, their positional status is such that are rebels against God, and so they stand as rebels against God, and thus God's wrath comes against them. I mean, the basic argument in sinners is, well, God just loves everybody. God's not in love with rebels. God's not in love with rebels. I mean, he loves his race in the sense that, yes, he formed them in his image, and so he looks upon mankind as something unique and special to him because they're created in his image. But when he looks at us from our real nature, what he sees in us is a rebellious, hateful heart. That's what he sees. And his wrath comes against that. Or as Paul puts it so aptly in Romans chapter 3, no one is righteous, no one seeks God. Okay, so the human race is not seeking after God. There are no seekers looking for God, which is why I've always found the idea of a seeker-sensitive church to be rather oxymoronic. Because there are no seekers out there. There's nobody seeking after God. The only way that anyone comes to God is if God seeks him. So we are rebels by virtue of the fact that Adam condemned us all to being conceived in sin and by nature children of wrath, the servants of sin. That word servants is probably better slaves of sin. I know it says servants, but Jesus called us slaves of sin, by the way. If any man sins, he is a slave to sin. Okay, so we are inclined to sin in every aspect of our nature just by virtue of being born under Adam's guilt. We are the subjects of death, meaning that we will die. And I would say there's another point to this too. Not only are we the subjects of death, meaning that we will die, but the human race has an extraordinary propensity and desire for death. Have you noticed that? Death seems to be something we revel in. I don't mean to offend anyone with this illustration, but some of the most popular video games out there are games where you shoot people dead, right? And some of the most watched TV shows are shows about death. The Walking Dead, right? And all the other spin-offs of that kind of zombie apocalyptic kind of thinking. Because human beings in their fallen state not only die, but in a twisted sense they now actually love death. I mean, they avoid it for themselves, but they have a propensity to it. So when the wrath of God comes upon a people and he lifts his hand of restraint, what is it that they begin to focus on? What is it that becomes the most important thing? Death. Fills in, rushes in when God's hand is lifted. So we're not just creatures who die, we're also creatures that are fascinated and obsessed with death itself. And all the other miseries, spiritual, temporal, and eternal. Okay, and all other miseries. Shall we make a list? Anybody want to make a list? Okay, I'll add one to the list. Okay, ladies, you'll love this one. Childbirth. That's a joyful experience, isn't it? Right? Right, ladies? I've never experienced it, but I've watched it. My wife loved it. She loved every minute of it. 18 hours waiting for Rachel to show up. It was an experience of a lifetime. But you will notice, and the reason I bring it up is because you will notice that was the primary purpose of the woman being created. the very thing she was created to do now became a point of suffering. When Adam and Eve sinned, they brought suffering into every aspect of the Imago Dei, every aspect of this world. And all of the miseries and difficulties and pains and sufferings and clogged arteries that we have in this life are all because of this reality. We can trace the root of every evil in this world to this one man who sinned. All the other miseries, spiritual, temporal, and eternal, unless the Lord Jesus set them free. So the confession writers insert at this point, because this is a dark chapter, right? It's like, oh, this is really, okay. I'm fascinated with death. I read this and I'm suicidal. So the confession writers put in here a note, and I think the reason they do this, because they're making a subtle hint of something that will come later. And that is, there's one man who brought all this misery. There's another man who brings freedom from it. Okay? And that man, of course, is Jesus Christ. So the contrast cannot be more obvious. The whole world is filled with misery and death and destruction and pain and suffering and all the theodicy questions and so forth. It's all filled with misery. And we can all attest to that, but, and it all comes from one man, but there's one man who's come to reverse it. There's one man who's come to change that, and that's key. And you will notice it's not something we do. It's something he does. See? We can't change our state. We have no power to overcome the guilt or pollution that's in us. And even as believers, we continue to struggle with sin. That's part of the concupiscence of the flesh. We can't seem to get around. But the one man has come to reverse what the one man brought. That's Romans 5 in a nutshell, okay? And it's a very powerful chapter. That's why I keep referring to it. Paragraph 4. From this original corruption, whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions. Okay, what does that mean? The original corruption that Adam brought into the world means, as we've already seen in the previous chapters, that we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good. We do not possess the ability to do good. No one does good. No one seeks God. Okay, Paul couldn't have been more clear in writing chapter 3 of the book of Romans. We are not inclined to do good. Our good is always susceptible to our own evil, our own selfishness and selfish desires. Can you do a perfectly selfless act? Can you do a perfectly selfless act? Many men have theorized that it's possible. But the problem is that when you do a selfish act, it becomes a selfish act because you're doing it for yourself, for a reason. You cannot do a selfless act for others because you do not possess the ability out of your corrupted nature. So the point they're making is that we are utterly indisposed and disabled and made opposite to all good and wholly inclined to all evil. Or, as Buddy Gray used to say, pastor that Roger and I know in Birmingham, used to say this. He said, you know, if it wasn't for the grace of God, I'd be a murderer. And I'm pretty sure my wife would be too. So the only reason that we do not commit every evil that's possible is because God, by his Spirit, restrains evil in this world. If the Spirit of God was not restraining evil, you have no idea what this world would look like in terms of evil. You think it's bad in the 20th century when 100 million people were killed under Stalin and Pol Pot and a few others. That's evil. But you can't imagine what it would be like when all 8 billion people on this planet are walking murderers. Well, first of all, there'd be a lot less than 8 billion people on the planet, wouldn't there? So what they're saying is we are inclined to every imaginable evil in our hearts. Don't ever say that you would never do evil of some sort. Oh, you are capable of it. You're capable of it. Now, as a born-again man, I do believe the Spirit of God acts in a way quite profoundly different, of course, than amongst the reprobate, in the sense that the new heart doesn't think about the idea of murdering somebody else, because it's a new heart. It's a new nature given to us. But what these confession writers are saying is that the human race, by virtue of its fall in Adam, is now inclined to do every imaginable evil, and therefore men like Stalin and Pol Pot and Hitler should not surprise us. They're representative of the race. But it's from this corruption that is noted, do proceed all actual transgressions, meaning all sin comes out of the nature of the fallen man. Or to say it in more contemporary terms, we sin because we are sinners. We sin because we are sinners. In many synergistic circles, that's reversed. Well, we're sinners because we sin. No. No. We do not become sinners just because we sin at some point, which is the reason why the bizarre theological idea of the age of accountability has crept into synergistic thinking, right? Well, look, my 18-month-old, right? She doesn't know. Oh, okay, let's use this little one over here. She doesn't know, right? So if she were to die tomorrow, she's perfectly safe because, right? She's born innocent and beautiful, and she smells nice, and, well, most of the time. And we look and we say, oh, what a precious thing. But it is out of the guilt of us that our sin flows, not the other way around. We don't become a sinner simply because at some point we choose to sin. Nope. It is out of the nature of the beast that the action comes. Or as someone once said long ago, my wife quotes this, what's down in the well comes up in the bucket. What's a part of us is what comes out of us. You want to know who you are? You want to know what your nature is? Look at how you behave. The fruit on the tree tells you what kind of tree that it is. Okay, that's the point. We sin because we are sinners. We're born as sinners. It's only a matter of time before this beautiful little one decides to look at her mother and defy her, because she has that in her nature. And those two parents over there are not sitting there thinking, not my child. No, my child will never go there. No, they're sitting over there going, yeah, we know. And we know because we have a couple of others in the house that proved it. Okay, so, I'm sorry I picked on you. But notice the point. We are sinners, and therefore we sin. So all sin flows out of our nature. And therefore all of the evil in this world flows out of the fallen nature of humans. All of the evil of this world flows out of the fallen nature of human beings. Even the catastrophes that occur, that seem to be beyond our specific responsibility, are still caused by the reality of a man who sinned and brought death and destruction into the world. Human beings sin because they're sinners. Right? That's a key element of understanding the human race. And then number 5. This corruption of nature during this life doth remain in those that are regenerated. Bad news, folks. Even if the Spirit of the living God has taken out your heart of stone and given you a new heart, born again by the Spirit of God, you still have the flesh to contend with. You still have the natural flesh to deal with. The corruption of nature during this life doth remain even in those that are regenerated. Or, I think this statement is inserted by the original authors in the Westminster and then on to the Savoy, is that there's no such thing as perfectionism in Christian theology. There's no such thing. There's no hint anywhere in the Bible that those who are born again by the Spirit of God will stop sinning at some point in their life. That's not to be found. We will have to continue to wrestle with sin and the consequences of the fall throughout the rest of our lives. The difference is that those born again by the Spirit of God possess the power to overcome it by the Spirit of God. Now, sometimes we don't want to. Sometimes the flesh is pretty strong, and we really want to do that sin that we really want to do, even though in our hearts we know it's wrong. But we are still, unfortunately, living in that unregenerate, the regenerate man is still living in that nature that is inclined to sin. We still possess that spiritual corruption, that physical corruption in us that carries on. And although it be through Christ pardoned and mortified, meaning that in Christ he has pardoned our sin, okay, and he's even mortified. I mean, he's put it to death in the sense that he has told you, you are not controlled any longer by the sin that you so love, right? He's pardoned it, he's mortified it, yet both itself and the first motions thereof are truly and properly sin, meaning this. The desire is as sinful as the action. The desire is as sinful as the action. Which is why there's no room in Christian theology for people to identify themselves by their sin and call themselves Christians. This confession says no. The temptation to sin itself is sinful, and the desire to commit the sin is in itself sinful. The first motions thereof, meaning that which provokes us to sin within the natural nature of either ourselves or temptation. By the way, the vast majority of the temptations you struggle with come from within yourself. They don't come from without, they come from within. And so those inward actions within you, that inward desires that you have within you, that you continue to wrestle with, you continue to struggle with. Yes, they've been mortified by Christ, and yes, they've been pardoned by Christ, and yes, Christ has said to you, you possess the power by the Spirit of God to overcome that, but it still produces real sin in us, and it's still a continuing struggle. Again, there's no room for perfectionism in this thinking. There's no room for us to say, well, one day I'm going to make it. I'm going to get there. I'm working on it. I'm going to get there. The reality is God has purposed to leave us in this fallen state and in this fallen world. He has not taken us immediately upon faith into his presence glorified. He has not chosen to do that. He's chosen to leave us, again, as a part of his decree, as a part of his purpose. He purposes for us to have to go through this life of temptation and trial and tribulation and trouble in order to glorify him. So we have two choices. We can chafe against all that happens to us. We can shake our fists at the heaven and say, God, why haven't you taken this away? Or we can say, wait a minute. These things God has purposed for his glory and for my good. Paul said, I have a thorn. Take it away. And God said, nope. My grace is sufficient for you. My power, my presence, the word that I've given to you, the friends that you have who are brothers in Christ, the church that you go to, all these things, they are sufficient to help you to get through this reality. And in the end, here's what I'm convinced of. In the end, when we leave this mortal coil and are ushered in the presence of God and we look back, what we will see is the hand of God working in every one of these trials and tribulations to bring glory to himself. You have no idea now what he's doing in your life or in the lives of those around you who are suffering. You don't know. All you know is they're suffering. All you know is that you're struggling with temptations. All you know is the difficulties of this life. That's all you know. That's all I know. But one day we're going to look back and we're going to see the hand of God at work in all of these pains and trials and tribulations, and we're going to see his glory shine through. And we will shout with praise more than you can possibly imagine. So let's be careful not to let our troubles and our temptations become a source of abandoning the promises that God has given to us. Because that's what many people do. So, there's a fall. A man fell. A man who had been charged the federal head of a race, he fell. And sin came into the world. Real sin and its consequences and its punishments. Even extending to us as those who are included in the decree as the elect. Even those of us who have received the grace of God by the Spirit of God. Even those of us who know Christ. This is still true in this world. But if we get this right, if we understand what's being said here, two things will be true. Number one, we'll get the rest of the gospel right. And number two, we won't be shaking our fists so much at the heavens and asking why. We will know why. Because God is glorifying himself through it to use it for his purposes.